Welcome to St. Sarah's Parish. We're a parish of the Apostolic Johannite Church in Boston. And this is our first introduction, actually, to Mystics of the Commonwealth, which is part of an ongoing series called the Forbidden Saints, in which we're looking at, today we're going to discuss some of the background and history of mysticism in the Commonwealth period of England, in England and particularly in New England. It's difficult to separate them because they're pretty much the same thing. People are coming from England at the time. Excuse me. So this is based on a lecture that was given by the Reverend Dr. Rufus Matthew Jones at Harvard University in 1930 and 1931. I guess it was a series, and obviously the book is much longer than one lecture. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what's going on. The purpose of this discussion and lecture series is to look at a small g Gnosticism, mysticism in other religious traditions and faiths, other than just the 19th century Gnostic church that we come from, or earlier churches. We're trying to see how Gnosis is actually received in other people without any kind of communication or cultural transmission. So, whereas we have the benefit of having the Nag Hammadi library already translated into English, these people obviously did not have anything to go off of. A lot of them didn't even have the Bible. So the story really begins in England, and it kind of happens in a strange way. In Germany at the time, and in Middle Europe, Martin Luther and others, including Jacob Boehme, who some of you know about. But Jacob Boehme, in his epistles, made a very interesting statement about the end of the 16th century, the beginning of the 17th century. He said that this was the beginning of the age of the lily. It was a very interesting use of terms, because we'll see that some of the mystics who came to New England, particularly here to Boston, Cambridge, were using that kind of terminology. And the interesting thing about that is that generally the floral scent is attributed to either saints or the presence of the holy, Shekinah, the presence of God or goddess, depending on the tradition. That angels or some great holy thing has come and is filling your sensory as well as your emotions and your spirituality with this incredible smell. So not only images and not only feelings of divine inspiration, but literal and physical manifestations. So Boehme uses a very interesting term because right here in Boston, there were several different kinds of people, not just Puritans. And Puritan is really not a very good term. It's a very general term. We have to understand that the story does begin, obviously, with Henry VIII and the opening up of the Church of England, taking away the authority of the pontiff in Rome. And this changes the face of Christianity at the precise moment that the printing press is starting up. So the two things happening at the same time has a tremendous impact on Christianity and on religion in general. Flowing from Germany and Switzerland, from Geneva up the Rhine, literally, to the Low Countries who were also Protestant. I mean, they were just becoming Protestant. So it follows the geography of Europe, up the Rhine, crossing the Channel, and coming into East Anglia, which is where most of the original colonists here in the Massachusetts Bay came from, which is why we have all these names. Boston and Cambridge are places which are in East Anglia, in the eastern part of England. Even the Fens, for example, we have the Fens here, they have Friends there, which is a sort of a marsh. So, what happens with all this? Well, obviously there's communication over the English Channel with this new free, sort of free anyway, the Church of England. So immediately after that, immediately after the sanctioning of the Church of England by Henry VIII, and so we're talking about the 1530s, the development of people's ideas on religion, on Christianity in particular, were changing. And they were given a certain amount of room. Not a lot of room, but some room to discuss and figure out what their spirituality was really about. So it's a reaction. People, the Church of Rome was, in the 15th century and the 16th century, very corrupt. And it was fighting against all these different powers which were surrounding it, usually involving both powers from the east and powers from the west, particularly France, Sicily, the Byzantine Empire, what was left of it. So there's a lot of that going on. But you'll remember that Henry's daughter, he had more than one daughter, obviously Elizabeth and Mary. Mary was the first child, and Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. So she was raised a devout Roman Catholic. And so when Henry died and his son took the throne, his son Edward died when he was very young because he was ill. If you've seen the Tudors, you know all this already. Leaving the country in a serious situation because Mary was betrothed to the Spanish prince who became king, and she was not interested in all this heresy that she saw around her. She was not interested at all. In fact, she was very much interested in making sure that England was brought back into the Roman fold. Well, a very interesting thing happened as a result of her bloody reign, as they call Bloody Mary. And that is that a lot of the Protestant nobility, the people who were already learning and reading Protestant or proto-Protestant literature coming from the Low Countries and from Germany and Middle Europe, they were ready to move to become a real power on their own terms. And she banished them, most of them. So instead of get your head chopped off or burned at the stake, of course, a lot of people moved. They left England and they went to, some of them went to France, some of them went to Germany. But a huge, you could say, community of expatriate English nobility had gathered in Geneva. And Geneva is the epicenter, you could say, of the Reformation. This is where John Calvin, who is one of the fathers of what is now Protestantism, and Calvin was quite a bit different from Martin Luther. Martin Luther, of course, was already ordained in the Catholic Church, as were a lot of other dissenters, first generation, you could say. John Calvin had studied theology, but he was not a Roman Catholic priest. And his ideas were much more radical in nature than, from the Catholic point of view, than Martin Luther, and even others. But the Geneva Bible was very important to this process. So for the first time, English people are able to read a Bible, a printed Bible. And this sets off a storm across the continent. I mean, these people are really interested in what they can read, they can actually get their hands on. So, what does this do? Well, it creates a whole sort of a class, you could say, not in terms of politics, but a class of people, like when you go into school together. Because that period of time, you have a lot of very influential English aristocrats who are Protestants, who are exposed to this thinking, and their children are exposed to Calvinism in Geneva. And so when they come back home, as you remember, Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, becomes the queen. And she makes it pretty much a policy of tolerance. At least, I mean, you had to be a part of the Church of England. But what you thought was up to you. She wasn't really in the business of dictating what people thought. And even to the point where Catholicism, although it was suppressed, wasn't really persecuted under Elizabeth until the Pope excommunicated her and basically said that she was a heretic and that it was the duty of every Roman Catholic in England to disobey her. That was a declaration of war, but that didn't come until later. So Elizabeth, you could say, is kind of the patron saint of the dissenters, because even though she doesn't agree with them, she's by far not a Puritan, obviously, but she allows them to exist. And there were people. There was a poet actually here in Massachusetts who died in North Andover, a woman, Puritan, who wrote poems. She was the first woman poet, I believe, in America anyway. She wrote poems to Queen Elizabeth. So people remembered what she did for them, and so the study of this new idea, Calvinism, this concept of a very simple kind of church, resonates with people because they're really reacting against being forced to do things that they didn't want to do. They had no idea what some of the liturgy meant, let alone being able to read it because it was in Latin. So there's a very strong reaction to that, and it's understandable because, let's face it, it's very easy now to look back and say, oh, wouldn't it have been nice if everyone stayed together? Well, that's what they've been doing since Nicaea. It wasn't working out very well. So it's unfortunate that we go in these kind of trends. People have a reaction to something, and then there's a reaction again, and it goes back and forth. Well, by the time Elizabeth dies without an heir, so the Stuarts are brought back in. James is her nephew, who becomes the King of England, and he also is the person who decides to have the King James version, or what was called the authorized version of the English Bible, translated and printed. So during that period, of course, between Elizabeth and Charles II, is a very tumultuous period in English history, the Civil War. In the Civil War, you have basically two different kinds of people. One who are monarchists and Anglicans, high Anglicans, some of them with Catholic tendencies, like the Prince James, who became James II. There is the other faction, which is pretty much what they call the Roundheads, followers of Oliver Cromwell. And most of those people are educated, middle-class townsfolk, who come from East Anglia. This is their stronghold. Well, Cromwell, as you know, was also a Puritan. So when the coup takes place, when the Civil War starts and, Parliament takes over, basically, and declares him Lord Protector, and they killed Charles I, after whom the Charles River is named here in Boston. These people here are happy because they're supporters of Cromwell. They're Puritans. So there's a lot of tension going on. But make no mistake about it, it wasn't until Charles II that regal authority is asserted again in New England. New England was very happy with the Commonwealth period, and of course everybody knows that we like that word because that's what we call the state that we live in, the Commonwealth. So the ideal of Cromwell and the Puritans was very, very, very popular here. So to the extent that we know that, for example, there's a tavern in Scituate that was actually founded by, I think it was a nephew of Oliver Cromwell. So there's a really deep and abiding relationship between people who live here, Puritans who lived in Massachusetts, and the people who lived in East Anglia. And the same is true of their spirituality. Now, at the beginning of this discussion, we've looked at this image here, which it's actually a piece of propaganda, or it was created by the government, the English government, in 1647. And it's called a catalogue of several sects and opinions in England and other nations, with a brief rehearsal of their false and dangerous tenets, dated 1647. And among these there's a Jesuit, of course, because the Jesuits were the people who were trying to bring Catholicism back into England. And there are Arminians and Arians and Adamites and what is called here a libertine, Anabaptists, familists, seekers, and divorcers, all kinds of rogues. And they showed little pictures of people. For example, the Anabaptist looks like he's trying to drown someone at the pool. And the libertine is trying to, it has a pickaxe and is taking a pickaxe to the Ten Commandments. The divorcer is beating his wife. The Adamite is naked, etc., etc. So this was no doubt a product of the Church of England, explaining the various things that were going on at the time and trying to keep people away from them. The interesting thing is, of course, that this is 1647. For example, the Quaker, you don't see Quakers there. Why? Because the Quakers actually were formed out of several of those. So a lot of these kind of came together and broke apart again. The Quakers have, I think, at least half a dozen different, you could say, sects within them, different sort of like, conservative and liberal type thing. But you get the general idea. There were a lot of different ideas going on out there. So what about Massachusetts? What about New England? So the mystics, these people, you see them pop up because there's a lot of controversy with this colony. Because basically they got a charter for this colony by making all kinds of economic promises to the king, saying we can do this and we can do that and you'll get 10% or whatever. And here's a list of people who are going to be the directors, you could say, of the company, the Massachusetts Bay. And it just so happened that almost everybody on the list was a Puritan, and the king didn't know that. I'm speaking before the Civil War happened. And even under Charles II, when there's another charter issued. They don't really tell. They're very diplomatic about who is what, and they have a lawyer. And they're not really, in London, and they're not really saying too much about who these people are. So the Puritans themselves are mostly centered in the east of England, and they have a stronghold at Cambridge University, and in particular at Emmanuel College. And Emmanuel College is absolutely vital for understanding what's going on. But it's also, in the Puritan world, but it's also what's going on in the mystical world. Because it just so happens that Emmanuel College, at exactly the same time, is home to what they call the Cambridge Platonists. So they're Platonic students of Plato, but we've talked about the Neoplatonic movement and how close it is to Gnosticism. We share a lot in common. In fact, many of the ideas are just interchangeable. So these books, Hermes Trismegistus, for example, Porphyry and Iamblichus, others, all these big names that we have in our world, they're among the first books that Harvard College had in their library. So people like Increase and Cotton Mather, who were rock-ribbed Puritans, no doubt about it, they're reading this stuff. But they're simple country folks too, people who came here because they were familists, which was one group of dissenters that believed in, they're very similar to us actually, they believed in the direct apprehension of the divine. They also believed in a fairly complicated hierarchy of priests and bishops and deacons and elders. So Dr. Jones is convinced that people like Anne Hutchinson, who was a leader, a mystic, and also a sort of proto-Quaker, and Mary Dyer, and Marmaduke Stevenson. These are some of her friends and colleagues who were claimed by the Quakers, and rightfully so, but they really predate an established Quaker colony, certainly, and they predate George Fox, so it was sort of looked at as being the father of Quakerism. Just a few years. I mean, I'm sure that later they become more, those who weren't hanged on Boston Common were more involved in the later stages or the initial stages of Quakerism. But for our purposes, Dr. Jones' lecture points out that Anne Hutchinson in particular was influenced by the familists, if not a familist outright. And I wanted to find out. He says, before Jacob Boehme's writings were translated into English, the family of love, which is the other name for the familists, was the most important source of popular mysticism in England. I'm convinced, he says, that this was the source of Anne Hutchinson's views, which so powerfully disturbed the peace of Boston and Cambridge 300 years ago. Modern writers have complained, as did John Winthrop, who was the governor, that there were a theological jargon which no man understood. So that gives you an idea of what some of the Puritans thought of this. And I wanted to share with you what they call high imaginations, or very spiritualist type thinking is something that George Fox, who's a Quaker, really understands. That's when Quakerism really starts to take off. But right before then, you see this kind of interesting combination of Jacob Boehme's ideas with the Cambridge Platonists. And all this is happening in a Puritan environment. So you have people who are affiliated with the Puritans, who come over here with the Puritans. They are, for all intents and purposes, Puritans, but their thinking is quite different. So these three people, Marmaduke Stevenson and Mary Dyer, were hanged. And the reason they were hanged wasn't because they were disagreeing with the religion. The reason, because they were expressly forbidden from doing that. The reason is because they were expelled from the colony for heresy against the Puritan code, or whatever it is that the general court had established as being the norm. And they left, and Anne Hutchinson, of course, left and never came back. She moved to New York, and but Mary Dyer and Marmaduke Stevenson said that they had a calling, that they had to come back to New England, because they just had to share this with everybody. And they felt that there was definitely a higher purpose to what they were doing. And that's exactly what they said before they were hanged. They said, we've done this because we know that with this, greater tolerance is going to come here. And it did. And it did very quickly. With the exception of the Salem witch trials, which happened over the course of a few months, in kind of a power vacuum at the time, keeping in mind that in Catholic parts of Germany that was going on until the late 1700s. It's a very, very brief, you could say, glitch on a plane, on a trajectory, I should say, of more and more openness until, through the Great Awakening and into the 19th century with the birth of the Unitarians and the split between Unitarians and Congregationalists, who are both originally Puritans. So, as you know, in New England we have one town will have the first parish is Congregationalist, and another town will have the first parish is Unitarian. It just depends on the town, because Unitarians were originally called liberals. And so it just depended on the congregation which way it went. This is much later. It's much later. Which is why we wanted to bring in somebody from different communities. So Reverend James Ford, who is the senior minister at the First Parish, at the Unitarian Church, First Unitarian Church in Providence, Rhode Island, has really been nice enough to come up and visit and talk to us about some aspects of Unitarianism and mysticism as well. So that's next month. And there's a huge amount of material. I highly recommend that you follow the links on the website. You can go to www.johannite.org and click on St. Sarah's Parish. We have a blog under news, and you can find the specifics about the different documents and things that we've been reading in the series. So that's the overview of who these people were, and sort of understanding how it flowed naturally. I always find it interesting when spiritual ideas follow nature in a way. That it follows the geography, it follows the Rhine up to the English Channel, and then over into the eastern part of England, and then finally to New England. You see how people are influenced by where they live. And it also gives us an opportunity to look at early New England people in a much different way. We usually think of them as being very strict and, it's a negative thing to call someone a Puritan nowadays, and this gives us an opportunity to look at their spiritual side, their mystical side too. So, any questions or open up discussion?
Are we going to hear a lot more about the transition from what we would consider Puritanism to Unitarian and Congregationalist? Is that going to be part of the...
Yeah. I'm not exactly sure what Reverend Ford is planning on doing, although of course he's going to be doing it from a Unitarian point of view. So I'm not sure if we're going to... He'll probably discuss some of that. He of all people will have all the detailed information on the early Unitarians. For example, there is a kind of Unitarian in Hungary as well. Of course, our Unitarians are English and American, but there is a relationship. And so, yeah, I hope he discusses some of that history. But as I said, here in New England, that change doesn't start taking place until the 18th century. The 18th century, and which is why the two branches, diverge. And you see quite a lot of other divisions going in. It's very complicated, but yeah.
So whenever we're talking about purely Puritans, people who are not breaking off from that, other aspects of mysticism in the main Puritan group, or are they mostly the people who come with the group?
Well, that's a good question. From what I understand, particularly from this lecture, but from reading other history on that subject, it looks like what's actually happening is, in England, that's the reason that I used this image, because I thought it was that important to understand that dissenters, they were called dissenters. What did that mean? It meant that they were dissenting not against the Catholic Church. They were not Protestants. I mean, they were Protestant, but plus being dissenters from the Church of England. Okay. So there are all these different movements going on at the same time. They're all dissenting against the established Church of England. So that's what they have in common. So I think that it was foggy, tenuous at best, to say, of course there were people who were very Calvinist, and those are the educated people, the people who were going to school, who went to Emmanuel College. Half the people that founded, Cambridge and Boston probably went to Emmanuel College, or Trinity College in Dublin. So, the relationship there is one that is defined, I think, better in some ways after they got here. Puritanism certainly existed, but it wasn't really a unified thing by virtue of the fact that it's congregationalist and anti-hierarchical. So it's kind of hard to have, a single Puritan ethic or a theology even, when there really isn't any way to enforce it, So in Massachusetts, the interesting thing is, of course, that New College, which later becomes Harvard College, is moved to Cambridge precisely because one of the leaders of the Puritan movement over here says, okay, we're going to open up the first parish in Cambridge, and the school is going to be right across the street, which it still is. So, the influence of the Puritan divines, they called them. They were religious leaders, who taught at the schools and so forth. They're really the only, they changed, which is why they changed so much in the end, probably. Because there isn't any written law that says this is what you must believe. Each congregation has the right to basically vote on things. And that's what started happening. And so I think it wasn't so much that these people, that these mystics were not Puritan. I think that we have to reimagine what that meant. And it was much more amorphous than solid, at the time. And it continued to be foggy and always redefining itself every few years. And you see that in the relationship between, for example, Cotton Mather and Increase Mather, his father, who, Cotton Mather is famous in the United States for a great many things, but he's most famous for the person who who defended the introduction of spectral evidence in a court of law, saying, and this is what the witch trials were all about, that you could use spectral evidence, which is ridiculous. And his father, who Increase Mather, who was the rector at Harvard, and he was also the rector of the Old North Church, disliked the idea so much that he took his son's book about spectral evidence out on Harvard Yard and burned it in front of all of his students. So there's not even really agreement between father and son here, So there's a lot of contention. And Thomas Hooker is another, Reverend Thomas Hooker, another one. He was involved with the original movement over here, the original colonization. I think he also went to Emmanuel College. I might be wrong about that. I'm pretty sure he went to Cambridge. He was a friend of Shepherd, who was the first minister. They had a falling out, and he took the people that disagreed. This was about voting rights. The General Court had established that not only did you have to own land, but you had to be a sort of member of a club in order to vote. And Thomas Hooker said that wasn't right, that anybody who was a Christian should be able to vote. And that wasn't very popular with the Cambridge group and the Boston group. So Thomas Hooker took the people who were from those congregations that were in favor of what he was saying, and they walked all the way to what is now Hartford, Connecticut, and started the Connecticut Colony. So, there's no great love between these people. And I would be hard-pressed to classify them as, as one group. In England, when you're faced with an oppressor, because it got ugly after a while, in the Church of England after, even during the later years of Elizabeth, but under Charles I, and even James, if you were, some dissenters got their ears chopped off. Can you imagine? Alive, having your ears cut off because of what they were saying. So, they really were oppressed. And they were discriminated against systematically, which is why they tried to bunch up together, and help each other. And you see that in, for example, the city on a hill that I talked about before. on the Arbella when they came over, when the Puritans came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they had a very strong feeling of solidarity among each other. But this was really important for them and for the world to see that this new way of being a Christian could work. And of course it didn't. It just led to more and more factions, and finally the Puritans get what they want. They get their own country, basically, and they turn around and start discriminating against people who have ideas that are different from what they have, those particular people have, you know. So it's just the oppressor, the oppressed becomes the oppressor in a few years. I mean, when the brethren who are not Puritans, the brethren, the Pilgrims, founded the Plymouth colony, which was, as you know, about 10 years before Boston. They were almost, I mean, their living and their charter was pretty much communist. I mean, they didn't own land. They shared. They were supposed to share everything, and they were supposed to work the fields equally and share food with everyone. And it was a miserable failure. It was a miserable failure. After a couple of years, not just the hard winters, but the young men started getting angry because, well, hey, if I work harder than this guy, and he's going to get, the same amount of corn and the same amount of wheat that I do, and he sat on his butt and didn't do, these problems started up a few years after they got here. So this ideal, though, they were very idealistic. And they had this ideal of making the kingdom on earth. And it's not very different from what Gnostics say either. But I think the difference is that they're focused on the outside, and they're looking up to God and saying, help us do this. And we're looking inward and saying, the kingdom is here. The kingdom is here already. The kingdom is all around us. We just don't see it very well. And how do we see it very well? Well, in the liturgy we talk about, being able to make a community, to have the courage to make community, to work together, but to see that the kingdom is already around us. This is very important. But you can't force people to do it. And this is the problem that I mentioned, going from being the oppressed to the oppressor in a very short period of time, because humans are like that. We scream and cry when something is against us, but when someone actually does the right thing for a change, we don't say it. We get we close our hearts and our minds, close with them. This is the big problem. The Puritan fathers are standing in judgment of Mary Dyer and Marmaduke Stevenson. Marmaduke Stevenson had one of the most beautiful experiences I have ever read about. And he was a plowman. He was a plowman. He was plowing, as plowmen do. And he was contemplating the divine. And that's when this kind of gnosis happens to him. And that's when he starts to smell the lilies, literally. And he was astounded. He didn't know what to do with himself. I've only ever read anything like that as an account of a saint. Someone like Francis, or, the lilies. It's a very moving experience, I'm sure. And here's a person who's willing to be hanged for it, and he doesn't care. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. What about the other two? Mary Dyer and Anne Hutchinson.
Anne Hutchinson was actually killed by some Indian raid later, but it wasn't and it had nothing to do with this, and it was in New York, or what was at that time called New Netherlands. Was obviously it was a little bit more liberal than Boston was at the time. And then Mary Dyer was executed, was hanged. She's one of the Boston martyrs. So she and Marmaduke Stevenson were both hanged on Boston Common.
The two of them, what were their kind of connections to what we would say Gnosticism, the small g, or mysticism?
Mary Dyer was, as I said, she was sort of like a disciple of Anne Hutchinson.
Okay.
And Anne Hutchinson is what I was reading about from this lecture, who was, he believes, was influenced by the familists. And the familists were, if you read about, I encourage you to look it up, Google familists, or the family of love, and just read about them. And you'll see the incredible likeness to Johannites there is. Really is a very close likeness. Okay, I think that's it.